Two. Hello, everyone. My name is Elijah Kallenberg, and I am the co-host of the Semitic Sundays podcast with,
Jad Hashem.
and we are joined today by a very special guest, Rachel Burnett. Rachel is a recent UCLA grad with degrees in Middle Eastern Studies and Psychology. While at UCLA, she was an undergraduate fellow at the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and J Street U's National Vice President of Communications. Her writing has been published in the LA Times, Times of Israel blogs, and The Forward, and she has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, KXNX Radio, and Moment Magazine. Today, all three of us are joining together to discuss a very important topic, the upcoming elections. Should we or should we not be voting for Joe Biden? Should we vote third party? Should Joe Biden even stay in the race? These are all questions we're going to dive into here and now. And so to get started, I want to pass the ball off to Jad. Jad, the first question I have today regards Joe Biden. There's been recent pressures coming out of the Democratic Party from Chuck Schumer, from Hakeem Jeffries, from Adam Schiff, saying that Joe Biden should step down. Do you believe this, or do you believe he should stay in the race? Do you believe he should step down? If so, should a younger, more progressive candidate take his place? What's your thoughts? And then we're going to go to Rachel.
Yeah, it's very obvious that President Biden is not up for the task of being president for the next 4 years. Just look at his approval rating, for example, which typically at this point hovers from around 36 to 38%. It would be, quite frankly, it would have to be one of the greatest political comebacks in the history of U.S. presidential elections for President Biden to win another term. And it's actually saying something, considering that it's really not out of the realm of possibilities that the Democratic candidate could win the presidency, especially because arguably the three most important states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, are all still toss-up states that could lean blue.
Yeah.
Joe Biden, obviously, especially with younger folks, has not been a popular president. I don't think his policies are all that popular in terms of his economic policies for the most part, even if he can tout strong numbers in certain factors. At the end of the day, Americans will point out the fact that go to the grocery store, prices are still too high. When they put gas in their car, they still fear the number that's going to be shown after putting in their debit card. And of course, with foreign policy, when you look at the situation of Israel and Gaza, something that young people especially have shown major disapproval of for the Biden administration, it seems as if this point, the Biden administration is sort of heading towards political suicide, in that they know their chances are dwindling. Of course, after the debate, it completely showed that the reports of Biden being the strong candidate behind closed doors probably was not really the case. And you have now prominent Democrats, including Representative Adam Schiff, who is probably going to be one of the next senators in the U.S. Senate. Even he has now been somebody who has called out Joe Biden, telling him to withdraw. You've even had Democrats now say to Joe Biden's face in conversations that he should drop out. It seems as if the process of Biden stepping down is maybe inevitable, but of course, it all comes into the hands of Joe Biden himself. I will say that I think Biden knows the fact that he won't win at this current pace, although he can't say that. I think that the Democrats need to put everything into having Joe Biden withdraw from this race. His catastrophes, in terms of the way that he mumbles and stumbles on stages and in private, it's not cutting it for the Democratic Party and for progressive voters. Now, that being said, I'm not sure who would be up for the task of taking Joe Biden's role besides Vice President Kamala Harris. I suspect that she would be the Democratic nominee if Joe Biden were to step down. And then from there, they would have to find another vice presidential pick. Me personally, I would love to see someone like Gretchen Whitmer become the Democratic nominee for president over someone like Gavin Newsom, who I think is portrayed too much as being too far on the left, especially with his California politics that many people don't like. But of course, President Biden stepping down is the only strategic move the Democrats can really make at this point if they want to save, I think, their chances of election in November, not only for the presidency, but also to retain the Senate and to hopefully make some gains in the House as well.
And before I jump in, Rachel, same question to you. And I want to get more also in depth. If you do believe Joe Biden should step down, who should take the reins? Joe, I think Jad has made it pretty clear that it should be Kamala. I disagree with that, but I'm interested to hear your take.
I definitely agree with Judd in insofar as Kamala should be the replacement for Joe Biden. I personally think he absolutely should step down. I disagree with you, Judd, that he knows he can't win. I think that he has deluded himself into thinking that he can win. It feels to me like we're having a lot of deja vu in 2016, where, in theory, the Democratic establishment should understand the stakes of this election, and that, especially this time around with a second Trump presidency, with Project 2025, they should understand the grave threat that a second Trump presidency would pose to American democracy, and interests of liberal democracy in America in general. Um, and I think that even though if I personally might like someone like Gretchen Whitmer to be the Democratic nominee, I think the only one that makes sense is Kamala. One of the reasons I think why Biden won't step down is because it will delegitimize, the Democratic campaign at large, or at least that's one of the sentiments that prevails. And I think bypassing Kamala as well as having Joe Biden step down sort of sends a message that, it's not just Joe Biden is a weak candidate, but this administration has failed. And so I think it would be a grave mistake to have anyone but Kamala be the front runner for the Democratic Party. I think, um, even though I understand like Whitmer would be a strong choice in theory, unfortunately, I don't think you can have two women on the ticket.
Yeah.
I think that Josh Shapiro would be a smarter choice for Kamala as vice president. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'll be voting in Pennsylvania. People love Josh Shapiro, like lefties like him, Republicans like him, and I think he would be a really smart pick. Also, because obviously she needs Pennsylvania, or the Democrats need Pennsylvania. That said, if Joe Biden does not step down, I will be voting for the Democratic ticket, but I feel that for the good of the country, for the good of, the chances of the Democrats to actually defeat Trump, because this is a winnable election. People like Democrats. Democrats are winning in the swing states, in the Senate races, but Biden is losing. And so this is a very winnable race. If Democrats run on the fact that, Donald Trump played a huge role in January 6th, abortion is incredibly popular within the U.S. electorate, running on the thing that Donald Trump will take away abortion rights, running on the chaos that his administration will bring, running on the danger of Project 2025. I think this could be an extremely winnable election for Democrats, but I don't see a viable path to the White House for a second term under Joe Biden.
That's I agree wholeheartedly with essentially everything you said. I think you hit on a very good point that's not talked about enough. And in that, I believe the role that we have today is to get out to vote. If you don't care about the top candidate, but at least get out to vote for the lower candidates. Make it a bottom-up approach rather than top-down. And I think that's what we're going to see propel Democrats to victory. I don't think Kamala will be something that really energizes progressives. I think because she's been associated with Joe Biden, she's been associated with the genocide in Gaza, that's going to be a stain for progressive voters. They're still going to have the same arguments they had for Joe Biden as they will for Kamala. So for progressives to really be energized from a presidential candidate, it's going to probably, in my opinion, have to be someone new that's not already in this administration. But the arguments you already touched on are a great reason why that can't happen. I think the most viable path for Democrats to beat Donald Trump is a grassroots approach. They have to be in love with the local candidates in the races. And from there, that'll percolate upwards and propel Democrats to a victory at the national level. But it's because local races were so important to Democrats, which they are. Democrats as a whole definitely care about the local races. And through that approach, I think they have a viable path to win. Now, something I'm very curious about is the question of lesser of two evils. Many progressives say this is not a valid argument. They say that both candidates are going to support a genocide, and I, in good conscience, cannot come out and vote for either of these two people. I need to be voting for Jill Stein or Cornel West. What say both of you? Is this a legitimate approach? Is the lesser of two evils argument valid from Democrats? As a whole, I tend to subscribe to, look, Trump is going to be worse. I do believe he will be worse. I think under Trump, we will see annexation. I think we will see the genocide increase tenfold. I had a conversation recently with a Palestinian friend, and he said, Joe Biden has done everything except give 2,000-pound bombs to the Israelis. And my pushback argument would be, Well, from a policy military standpoint, yes, but from a futuristic standpoint of what he will allow, Biden's red lines are clear. No annexation, no resettlement of Gaza. The West Bank cannot be annexed. Trump, that all goes out the window. And so I'm curious to hear both your thoughts on this issue. Is Biden the lesser of two evils, and is that a good enough reason to vote, even if he stays on the ticket come November, for him? Jad, I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's no doubt that President Biden is the lesser of two evils in this case. Listen, I think that when there are only two viable options, and I mean that it's really two candidates who can win this race, let's stop pretending that someone like Jill Stein or Robert Kennedy can win this race. I'm done talking about the 0.001% because I've had people tell me that, you shouldn't rule anybody out, but, we're being realistic using mathematical evidence, for example. Listen, I think that when you have two realistic candidates who can win, you have a moral imperative to vote for the lesser of two evils. I have said this before. I strongly disagree with the way that Joe Biden has handled the situation in Gaza. Obviously, the fact that we've supplied so many arms to Israel, even with these red lines that we've given them, it seems as if they've been able to jump over and, quite frankly, dash through it. My fear, of course, though, and I've spoken to many people in Gaza about this as well, the fear is that if Trump were to be in, this would be completely accelerated, and we would perhaps see complete annihilation of Gaza, perhaps annexation of the West Bank. I mean, just look at the Adelsons, for example, who obviously had influence in moving and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the embassy. And now you have, of course, the fantastic Miriam Adelson, who's the owner of My Dallas Mavericks, who is someone who would like to annex the West Bank and is trying to get Donald Trump to do that. I mean, it's complete, just horrific rhetoric. And what I would tell people, especially young people, is, I mean, just look at who Israel wants to be in. I mean, ask Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who they want to be in as president. They would both, of course, pick Donald Trump. I think the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump could be 40,000 Palestinians killed versus maybe 400,000 Palestinians killed. Listen, obviously, I oppose the genocide, and I oppose sending this weaponry to Israel to be used. I've had immense criticism of how Israel has used their weaponry to kill innocent civilians, even if they say it's in the name of going after Hamas. Um, what we have to understand, though, is we live in reality. We live in the year 2024. We still live in a country where we're going to have support for the state of Israel just as a nation. And I mean, look at what Republicans have said. They are the ones, for example, who sign off on bombs saying finish them. They are the ones who talk about Israel needing to finish the job and do whatever it takes. I mean, look at the Republican National Convention when people are talking about I mean, literally tonight you have a family of an Israeli hostage making a speech in support of the Republican Party and in support of the right-wing Israeli government, which is actually not even a very popular stance among families of hostages in Israel. They're the ones who are typically now you see at the front of many protests demanding a ceasefire. Biden is open to a ceasefire. Biden has also given a restored aid to Palestinians. Obviously, listen, you can only give so much credit when you're sending money to Palestinians, but you're giving weaponry to Israel. You can only give so much credit when you open up the pier and it ends up really not doing anything. But I think that right now what we're looking at bad policy versus potential horrific policy. I think that under Donald Trump, we would be seeing perhaps the non-existence of the West Bank and perhaps the complete dissolution of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians in Gaza into the Mediterranean and the Sinai Peninsula. I don't think that it's really even that much of a kind of outside thought. I think that Donald Trump would be even worse for the people of Palestine. And as a Palestinian, as much as I disagree with Joe Biden on this issue, and I think I would never be able to forgive him on the way he's handled this, the fact of the matter is that to make change, you have to find a way to make change within the Democratic Party since they are the most progressive of the two. The Republican Party is going to continue to actually accelerate this trend, and they're going to put this situation even worse than we could imagine. And what I will say is this: I think if Donald Trump were president right now and this was all going on, I think that many Palestinians and progressives would be begging for Joe Biden to come in and be president so that he could magically solve this issue, even if that's not realistic. I simply think that you have to choose the lesser of two evils in this case, and maybe that's unpopular, and I understand. But I fear that if Donald Trump comes into office, we might see the end of the prospects of a Palestinian state. And again, just ask the Israelis who they want to be president. The Israelis and the far right government will all tell you they're waiting for Donald Trump to come in so they can do whatever they'd like.
Yep.
And Biden is certainly not perfect, certainly has been bad on this issue. But I think that we are potentially talking about the situation being 10 times worse, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think the way I like to describe it is under Joe Biden, we have deaths of Palestinians, but under Trump, we will have the death of Palestine. And I fully believe that. I believe the West Bank will be annexed. I believe at least northern Gaza will be resettled and potentially annexed, whereas southern Gaza will be put under some form of military governorship or reoccupation with potential resettlement down the line. You hit on a very good point that a lot of people are not entering into the discourse about Trump and Biden, in that Biden actually has a party that's pushing him in a more progressive direction. Trump's party is pushing him in the opposite direction. He will get pushback if he doesn't go far enough in support of Israel. You hit on Miriam Adelson, how she's literally giving him $90 million with the stipulation that he has to recognize the West Bank as under civilian annex rule of the state of Israel. So I can't imagine any future where that doesn't happen with the Trump presidency. However, I'm interested, Rachel, do you agree with Jad? Do you think the lesser of two evils argument is valid? If not, I'm curious to hear why not.
I do. And I also think what progressives fail to recognize is Jill Stein is, not a perfect candidate by any means. For example, her whole idea of quantitative easing as a way to solve student loan debt makes no financial sense.
Yeah.
She's, held hands with 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And on Israel Palestine, she was specifically asked if she supported a two-state or one-state solution. And she said she wasn't informed enough to say, but yet, she throws around, buzzwords around Israel Palestine all the time that she knows sound good to progressives. And so, even if, a Jill Biden presidency is, of course, just a complete electoral impossibility, I think like romanticizing her policies is in any way, sensible in their own right. Would they, in theory, be better than Joe Biden's? Sure. But, she's by no means a perfect candidate. And yeah, I think that I do believe that a third party vote is a throwaway vote, especially when the stakes are this high in an election. And I think it does matter where you live. If you want to throw away your vote and you live in California, I think it's dumb, but I'm not, going to care as much as than I would if you live in a swing state. I live in Pennsylvania. I vote in Pennsylvania. So that to me, if you are living in Pennsylvania, you have to vote for Joe Biden, in my opinion. Yeah. I also think for me, even though I am horrified at Joe Biden's policy vis-a-vis Israel Palestine, I don't I understand why many Palestinian Americans and many Arab Americans feel that they cannot vote for Joe Biden because of his policy. It makes me angry. But I can't honestly say that if, Biden had oversaw, the murder of 40,000 Israeli Jews or Jews in another place around the world, if I would still feel like I could vote for him. I would like to think that for the sake of democracy at large in the country, I would be able to, but, I don't honestly know if I could. But yeah, I think the stakes are really, really high in this election. I think a third party argument would have been a much more valid argument, say, in an Obama-Romney election or something like that, or even Obama-John McCain.
The stakes are lower.
Right. But when the stakes are this high, I think it's just, a completely dangerous thing. And I think a lot of the problem with many young progressives is, it's all about optics and how it makes them look and feel rather than, doing things that are actually going to ultimately serve the greater good. Yeah. I also think one point I have heard about Trump and Biden and their policy when it comes to Israel and Gaza is that Trump would receive more criticism from the left than Biden currently receives because, liberals would be more willing to say, oh, well, it's Trump. Everything he does is horrible, which I think is an interesting point. But I also think, the fact that he what they talk people talk a lot about how he made Jerusalem the capital
Hmm.
in his presidency, which I definitely think was significant. But I think what was far more significant and is much less talked about is the fact that Mike Pompeo, um, under Trump's administration, made a decision to label all products made in settlements
Hmm.
as made in the West Bank rather than made in Judea and Samaria. And so for me, as someone who, as I like to say, is Shomer BDS when it comes to products from the territories, like I now no longer can do that
Hmm.
because of Mike Pompeo's conflation of the West Bank with Israel proper. And so that move was a very significant move in US policy, which Biden to date has not yet reversed
Hmm.
in, de facto annexation. And so I think that in particular is far more indicative to me of what Trump policy towards Israel and Gaza will look like rather than moving the capital.
That's a great point. I honestly, that definitely does not come up in discourse enough. I have an interesting hypothetical for you, Rachel. So we're both Jewish. Let's go back to 1936, say, and there's a risk of genocide looming with the Nazi Party, with the risk of taking over Europe. And we have two American candidates. One says, I fully support whatever the Nazis want to do. If they want to obliterate every Jew in Germany or in Germany and beyond, they're allowed to do it. Another candidate says, well, it depends how far they go, right? We have some red lines, but we'll let them have some of their own policy, but to a point, basically, before we step in and say that you cannot pursue this any longer. In total, maybe one person supports the deaths of all Jews, the other one only supports the death of 1 million Jews. As a Jewish person, could you, in good conscience, say we should be voting for the one that's only going to allow 1 million deaths because we have no other viable alternative, and it's in order to stop the person who would support, say, 6 million or plus Jewish deaths in Europe and make parallels to this situation? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, if, the current situation in Gaza was happening to Jews, I don't know what I could have, again, I'd like to say that I would choose harm mitigation,
Hmm.
because, I personally believe that that's the best strategy. And, Jewish tradition teaches us that, any life that we can save is a life worth an entire world. And so
Yeah.
by that metric, I think that we should take, a harm reduction and harm mitigation approach.
Yeah.
But I also understand that it's not my cousins,
Hmm.
it's not my grandfather or my sister, who are in Gaza right now. And so I'm speaking from a very different positionality, but, I can only speak for myself. And I believe that we should be voting in a way that will mitigate harm. I also think one thing that's important to point out is, Joe Biden will be a second term president.
Yeah.
And I think that also will allow him, in theory, more like flexibility when it comes to actually pursuing a viable future for Palestinian statehood. I'd like to think that by some miracle, he wins,
Hmm.
and he's on the ticket, that he would step down and recognize that he is not physically capable
Hmm.
of holding office. And I do think Kamala would take a more progressive approach. She's indicated as much in a lot of press interviews. Would she be as progressive as Bernie Sanders or Rashida Tlaib? Of course not. But I think that Kamala, in theory, in a second term presidency, like would seek policies that actually held down red lines in a more serious way than we've seen from Biden and his administration. Um, and so I think that, I also do think that there are a lot of progressives who don't like Kamala, but they don't necessarily conflate her with all of the decisions from the Biden administration and
Hmm.
would support her. And so I don't necessarily agree with your earlier assumption that, people just see her as, Biden 2.0. I think, would her, administration be radically different? Would it, would she like sit in and join in an encampment? Of course not. But I think that we would see a change in policy under a Kamala Harris ticket and a Kamala Harris presidency vis-a-vis Israel and Gaza.
Now, I agree with that. I think we would see a policy difference, but do you think the majority of progressives connotate her if she was actually running as president as having those different views than Biden?
I do. And I also think that even though obviously the progressive vote is important for Democrats, I also think that there are plenty of voters on the middle who won't vote for Biden because they see him, as too old, not capable of the office. And I think that they also might be drawn in by Kamala.
Interesting. And this is a hypothetical, but some progressives I talked to said if we don't get someone who's ultra progressive, not Kamala, not even Gavin Newsom's progressive enough, then they're just going to boycott this election because many of them are waiting out for a potential change in candidates. What would you say to those people who are saying, look, I'm going to completely boycott this election if we don't get who we want as the replacement?
I mean, I think that, again, I feel like if you live in California versus if you live in Michigan, those are two very different places to be making those kind of statements. But at the end of the day, I think, honestly, that, if your progressive values are because you care about the dignity and sanctity of all human life and you want to be able to preserve that on as much of a grand scale as possible, and you're not, taking every possible measure to do that, even if it, might not be the perfect path to doing so, I think that that is an irresponsible decision. And, it is our civic duty to vote. And unfortunately, we don't have the option in this election of necessarily voting with our complete conscience, but, we can do all that we can to stop the extreme dangers that a Trump presidency would entail.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I do think it would be easier for a new candidate who is fresh because they don't have, of course, the past 9 months of policy under their belt to only be saying the word ceasefire for the next 3.5 months. And of course, that's going to make it a way easier with progressives. But I think you're completely right. If you don't also get Kamala, you open yourself up to a host of issues. If the candidate is not Kamala, I think you're going to alienate Black voters because they're going to say, oh, is it because of her race? Did you want to put in someone like Gavin Newsom because he's white or Gretchen Whitmer? So I think you're also opening yourself up to a host of other issues. I want to bring it back to Jad, and I want to get into some questions that were brought to us by some of our listeners. And one of those questions is, and I think it's very interesting, is there any case you can make that would a Trump presidency would be better for Gazans than a Biden presidency? Is there any potential there for that?
No. I mean, that's my short answer, but I'll elaborate. And yes, I mean, by the way, whoever asked this question, I thank you for asking. But it's a naive question. I mean, listen, obviously, I wish there was a candidate who would be better on the issue. But the Republican Party is going to bulldoze Gaza if they can. And not just because they love Israel politically, but biblically speaking, they wouldn't mind seeing Israel expand. The people of Gaza right now, sort of what I like to mention, which is sort of an interesting analogy, is I think that right now, with Biden, it's almost like in a way that Biden is sort of like, when it comes to voting, it's kind of like to eat pork. It's obviously haram. It's seen as disgusting. It's seen as something you can never do. I think voting for Trump, on the other hand, is like starvation. And
it's
in
even
cases
more
where
if you only have pork, you're allowed to eat it. It's permissible. So yeah,
that's right. Obviously, the idea of eating pork, for example, is sinful, and also voting for Biden is not something that you would want to do in good conscience.
Yeah.
But obviously, I think that there's no debate as to the fact that Donald Trump, if he becomes president, would basically oversee the annihilation of Gaza. And I don't think there's any sort of way he can pander to Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans by saying, yeah, we're going to get this war done quick. That's probably rhetoric for annihilating Gaza, not just getting a ceasefire deal.
I think your analogy is really smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that.
President Biden,
another example, Jews stealing the ideas and the
there you go. I do want to say one thing though, and this is kind of off topic, but I think it's important. I know some people might be upset with what I have to say, but I think it's important because as much as I disapprove of how Biden has handled this, I think people need to understand something else, which is that Biden is not the prime minister of Israel, and he's not the leader of Hamas. For a ceasefire to happen, it can't. Joe Biden can only do so much.
Sure.
Obviously, the the allowing for the billions of dollars that we've sent in military weaponry that's been used to annihilate Palestinians is disgusting and gross and needs to be cut off. And he claims that he's not sending offensive weaponry. I think defensive weaponry, completely different thing. Iron Dome funding, I have a complete distinction for. And I should say that. And Elijah and I have talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
But what is interesting, sort of in this case, is that, it still is up to Hamas and Israel to agree on the ceasefire deal.
Mm.
If they don't agree, the ceasefire deal has to be between Hamas and Israel. If they don't agree, if those two sides can't agree, President Biden can't do anything about that.
Mm.
He talks to Israel, he talks with Hamas, he talks with Qatar, he talks with Egypt. And we have people in the US who have reached out for diplomatic solutions for a ceasefire. And Biden, of course, has endorsed now ceasefire deals.
Mm.
But if Hamas doesn't agree, and if Israel doesn't agree, and if they don't agree to a hostage deal, it's not going to happen. And so in that situation, it's in the hands of Israel and Hamas. Now, some people might say, well, shouldn't Hamas just surrender and get this war over with and release the hostages and the war ends? And to be fair, the war probably does end if that happens. What I will say, though, however, is obviously
Yeah.
that doesn't end the greater conflict. And what we would probably end up seeing is Gaza being annexed. Because as bad as Hamas is, and as much as I don't like Hamas, I do think the one thing Hamas has going for it is the fact that it's probably the only thing that's stopping Israel from annexing Gaza. I
Mm.
think if Hamas were to be completely dissolved, Gaza and the people of Gaza will be done.
Mm.
And done as in driven off.
Mm.
And so I think that for an organization like Hamas, for example, there has to be negotiations, which I know is taboo to say. You can't negotiate with terrorists. But I think there has to be some sort of direct negotiation with a group like Hamas, because at the end of the day, their interests, whether we agree with them or not, they are the elected body of Gaza, and they were chosen by the people of Gaza, of course, in 2006.
Mm.
But in my opinion, it's not up to the United States or Israel to dissolve Hamas from their power. It's up for negotiations for that to happen and for new elections to happen. And Joe Biden can only do so much about that. That being said, Joe Biden, in order to gain trust of Palestinians, he has to recognize Palestinian statehood. If Spain can do it, if Slovenia can do it, France seems like they might be a willing participant in doing that sometime soon. If these countries are willing to do it, if Belgium is going to do it, Ireland's done it, the United States needs to step in and say we are officially for a two-state solution that encompasses the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
You know what makes that,
And
before you go on, you know what makes that even more insane? We have laws on the books that if the US ever recognized a Palestinian state, we would have to cut funding to the World Health Organization, we would cut fund to UN food programs. It's crazy because we're stipulating any recognition of Palestinian sovereignty with global hunger. So there are laws on the books that are entrenched to prevent that from ever happening, and it's a freaking catastrophe. But yeah, sorry, continue.
yeah, and so yeah, just again to summarize my point, it's up to Hamas and Israel to get the ceasefire deal done. Obviously, Joe Biden still has completely mishandled this by sending the offensive weaponry because, I mean, let's be frank, we know Israel has a history of abusing Palestinians and killing Palestinians just basically for hunting at this point. It seems as if that's what they're willing to do. And of course, not to mention repeated charges of sexual assault and rape, and not to mention the bombing of refugee camps and safe zones and all this stuff. But the ceasefire deal at this point, I'm not going to put in the hands of Joe Biden. It's going to have to be in the hands of Hamas and Israel, and both of them need to be willing partners. Both have committed war crimes. Obviously, Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th, and Israel has pretty much committed every single war crime you can imagine since then, violating international law. But it's up to those two partners to get the deal done. And I think that it wouldn't happen under a Trump presidency. I think that Trump would just say, let's annihilate Gaza. And by the way, the idea of Israel annihilating Hamas, I just posted about this earlier today. If anything, numbers suggest that actually the number of Hamas fighters has increased since October the 7th. Because of the recruitment that has been made. So really great success by the IDF. They've actually dug themselves in a deeper hole, it looks like.
Yeah. I agree with a lot. Like, basically 99% of what you're saying. But with regards to Biden, my main issue that I'm slightly deviating from you from is the fact that he has shielded Netanyahu. I understand that he can only go so far in implementing a ceasefire, getting it up and running, and that needs to occur between Netanyahu and Hamas. But during the debate, Joe Biden flat out said that the only impediment to a ceasefire is Hamas. I completely disagree with that. In fact, I would say Netanyahu is the main impediment to a ceasefire. We have seen Hamas willing to come to the table, agree to relatively moderate terms, I would say, by their standards, whereas Netanyahu is intentionally muddying ceasefire deals left and right. Qatar has said this, US has said this, Egypt has said this. He's intentionally trying to prevent the ceasefire from coming. Why is that? For a Trump presidency. He knows the question of ceasefire will go out the window a second Trump comes into power. And from there, he'll be free to annex probably northern Gaza, resettle northern Gaza. Smotrich's plan to annex the West Bank was recently released. Why hasn't that been implemented yet? Because he's waiting for Donald J. Trump to come back as president, because he knows he will recognize the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria as sovereign Israel. So in terms of Joe Biden, he needs a rhetoric shift. A policy shift, I don't think is possible, but a rhetoric shift is possible. He needs to stop shielding Netanyahu in every forum, and that comes with pressure. But Rachel, I'm going to pass it on to you. Do you agree with Jad? Do you think that this is primarily in the hands of Hamas and Netanyahu? I mean, we have precedent from Ronald Reagan's era when he called Menachem Begin to say you need to have an immediate ceasefire in southern Lebanon, which he did. Do you believe Jad's underselling the role of Biden in this? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think that the Biden administration, if they had different policy, I do think things would be dramatically different on the ground. I also, I see a lot of time within, the American Jewish community, people saying like, why don't people protest Hamas? Like, why aren't people up in arms that Hamas refuses ceasefire? And I think the answer there is pretty obvious. It's because Israel's an ally of the United States. The Biden administration is going to have a lot more influence in Israeli policy rather than Hamas policy. I think, in Qatar, they're going to have a lot more influence over what Hamas does. So I think while I assume many people in Qatar, I was going to say many Qataris, but most people in Qatar, not Qataris. That's a whole nother podcast. But yeah, I think that there are probably many people in Qatar who disagree with Israeli policy very strongly. But, I think there should be an understanding, or in Egypt, for example, that, there's going to be a lot more leverage based on, because of how diplomacy and foreign policy works. The United States does not have the same kind of leverage over Hamas that it has over Israel. Hamas, has no reason to listen to the United States. They're mutually enemies with each other. And so, if, the Israel and the United States are friends, and you're with your friend, and, they've had too much to drink, they're, being aggressive at the bar, hitting on a woman inappropriately, throwing up everywhere, if you keep giving them more alcohol, you're a bad friend. And so it's, as a good friend, it's the United States job to remove Israel from that situation, take them out of that environment and stop supplying them with, the alcohol in this situation. And so, yeah, I do think that as Americans, like, we have played a role in this conflict. I'm looking forward to reading The Blind Spot by Khalid El-Aghendi to talk about, America's role in relationships with Palestine. And so I feel after reading that, I can probably speak more intelligently for how, America has made it more difficult for Palestinians to achieve sovereignty and statehood. Rashid Khalidi has also talked about this at length. But yeah, I do think the American role is significant. Ultimately, yes, it's going to have to be Netanyahu at the end of the day who agrees to a ceasefire. The US can't force him to, but I think that the US role is and has historically been incredibly critical in determining the future and the livelihood of Israelis and Palestinians. And whether that's good or bad, one can argue about, but that's the reality.
Yeah, we had IDF reports coming out last week that they were low on ammo, and it was a big cause of concern, and Netanyahu just brushed it aside. I think personally, I believe Hamas generally wants a ceasefire. I don't think Netanyahu does. No matter what Joe
Right.
Biden and the U.S. does, even if they cut off all arms, I think Netanyahu would simply go to someone else in the short term to try and get the weapons he needs to inflict as much damage as possible. In terms of his aspirations, his first immediate goal was to leverage U.S. foreign aid to Egypt, in my opinion, to drive Palestinians into the Sinai. Egypt did not cave. They did not let the Palestinians go into the Sinai. And so now I think it's to concentrate them in southern Gaza while they build up infrastructure in the north to allow resettlement. I don't think no matter, essentially it's impossible, I think, for Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire. I'll believe it when I see it, but I don't think there's a viable way that we get him to agree to a ceasefire. I don't think anything Joe Biden can do at this point will make it happen. If it could, it would have happened. So I think I'm very bleak in my outlook for the future. I think we all know that Netanyahu, like Jad has said multiple times, is waiting for a Trump presidency. He is waiting, in my opinion, for annexation, for resettlement, and from the river to the sea for it to be one Jewish state called Israel. Um, Going back to our initial question that sparked this dialogue, would a Trump presidency be better in any form for Palestinians? And it's ironic, some Palestinians say yes, and there's two reasons for that. The first reason, and Jad kind of hinted at this, or sorry, no, Rachel actually hinted at this, that it would unify Democrats as being opposed to our policy in Israel once and for all. If it's connotated with Trump, everything Trump does is bad. And so Democrats will finally be on the side of Gazans. They'll come out and protest for them. It'll be glorious. There's another more nefarious reason than that, I would say, in that it's that there's already one state on the ground that's controlling from the river to the sea, and that's Israel. Annexation would simply put what we know is happening into actual governmental practice. The military occupation in the West Bank is brutal, but in reality, we know it's really one state Israel. Israel controls the affairs of everything that goes in and out of the West Bank and Gaza. They control essentially the PA through their influence. So even in areas A and B in the West Bank, it truly is under Israeli control to a degree. Annexation would simply just make that outright. It wouldn't really change the situation, in my opinion. And Palestinians say, because that is the actual situation once and for all, where we say, oh my gosh, they finally annexed. This was the situation on the ground, but they finally did it. Now the world can see Israel for what it really is. And they say that's going to be the benefit because Israel is going to show its true colors once and for all, even though they already have in the genocide. But I'm curious, Jad, as a Palestinian, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a viable argument with annexation occurring under Trump that will finally be a mask off moment for Israel, for the whole world? Or do you think that's just going to be a catastrophe that needs to be avoided at all costs?
I think there's actually some merit to it. I mean, listen, I think that Israel can only get away with so much. I mean, it feels like, at least for Palestinians, we kind of just think that Israel gets away with basically anything they want to, and for the most part, it's pretty much true.
Yeah.
I mean, they kind of don't have to follow what the UN says, for example, especially with what the U.S. kind of in their partnership and what they kind of get to say about that. Listen, if Israel were to formally annex the West Bank, I mean, listen, they already are illegally occupying the West Bank, and the U.S. doesn't really care about that. If that were to happen, then I think even the U.S. would have to say, "Hey, this is completely unacceptable, and it's an obstruction for peace." In fact, today the Knesset just voted to condemn the idea of a two-state solution as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's an obstruction to peace. Look at what the data shows for the people in Gaza. Overwhelmingly, the people in Gaza, the Palestinians, want a two-state solution. They want to live. They want to stop dying. They want to stop having military at their doors in the West Bank. And so, a two-state solution, of course, it's not a perfect solution by any means, but it is sort of a temporary way to stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
And maybe annexation would do that. I mean, obviously, the only thing I can think of in that situation that would give any sort of hope would be if Israel were to actually give Palestinians citizenship and give them equal, full human rights. But obviously, that's not the case. They'll just push the Palestinians into Jordan or Syria or whatever neighboring Arab country. I just fear that still, to some point, Israel can kind of do whatever, and they'll probably still get away with it to some degree. I think it's Israel is that much of an exception. I think if Israel annexed the West Bank, yes, there would be pushback in the U.S. too, but I don't know if that would get us closer to the idea of full liberation. I don't know necessarily, and I will also say, by the way, October 7th, and maybe this is for some people it's not appropriate to say. I do think October 7th, the tragedies of October 7th and the horrific nature of killing Israelis. I mean, I do think it's gotten Palestinians closer to statehood. I mean, look at all the countries that have recognized Palestinian statehood in 2024. And most Palestinians will tell you that October 7th was worth it because obviously resistance takes time. Obviously, I'm not for killing innocent Israelis as a means of resistance, but Hamas, I think that Palestinians will make a distinction between condemning Hamas versus condemning October 7th. I obviously condemn October 7th. That being said, I think a lot of people who are genuinely in Hamas, who are see themselves as resistance fighters, I don't think I can condemn them, to be completely honest, if they're not going to want to target innocent people, for example. And I do think Hamas is the only thing that's probably stopping Gaza from being annexed, as I mentioned. And I do believe at the end of the day, Hamas is both a terrorist group and a resistance group. In some cases, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Haiti, for example, the way they've carried out their revolutions, I think people would argue that it's a similar tract, even though I don't agree with going after innocent civilians. I mean, I'll say this, the world has woken up sort of already to the idea of Palestinian struggle with the deaths of 40,000 Palestinians.
Mm.
And maybe annexation of the West Bank would contribute to that, but I'm not willing to take that risk, I don't think. I think I'm willing to put this in the hands of the Palestinians as well. And I will say this, the Palestinians won't be defeated. They're not going to go anywhere, right? They're not going to willingly move out of the West Bank. And I think as of right now, they're willing to put, their hands, they're putting their trust in the hands of Palestinians, and by the grace of God, to be honest. I think that's kind of what we see it as. And so, again, I think that if anything, Palestinians will want to elect Hamas in the West Bank probably, and kind of support a resistance movement there to stop annexation. And I think to some degree it actually would halt the annexation of the West Bank, which again is maybe sinister, but there's a reason Israel obviously pulled out of Gaza. And I think they would probably, a lot of people would move out of their settlements if they saw that Hamas got to power in the West Bank as well.
That's a good point to bring up. I think the reason Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza was to prevent the peace process from going forward, ironically. It also bolstered their capabilities in the West Bank. But I think Ariel Sharon knew that a group like Hamas would probably take power, and they would be the face of now Palestinian liberation. The West would never normalize a group like Hamas. And so he actually had the intent to freeze the peace process by pulling out of Gaza, which is very ironic. On the question of annexation, uh, there will be 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs from the river to the sea in total if annexation occurred. So it's the question now of citizenship. Do you give those Palestinians citizenship? And a government that's run by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir would say no. Smotrich has already made this known. He says that they should be subjects under a Jewish state. They should not be citizens. And subjects have to be governed. They should not be equal participants. And so those who are not willing to be subjects are going to have to be forced out of the state. And so that's why I believe one state will be it already is apartheid, but the apartheid will be undeniable in terms of definitional issues with the UN and other groups. And so to me, that does provide some hope, believe it or not. From the river to the sea, the struggle now becomes for one state that's democratic and represents all its citizens, which I've been fighting for. And I think annexation speeds up that process, ironically. But Rachel, I'm interested to hear your takes. Is there any benefit to the harm that Trump will bring if he allows something like annexation to come about, if he allows for resettlement in Gaza? What are your thoughts on this? And this will have to be our final question because we're at time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first argument that Democrats will be more willing to have the political courage to speak out against US policy is a salient one. I think the one about like harm acceleration as a means of bringing about, you know, the goals that we want, because we're like, oh, if things get bad enough, the world will wake up and see how bad it really is. And unfortunately, I think that's giving people too much credit. And I don't really subscribe to the theory of harm accelerationism. And yeah, I mean, I do think I agree that we're living in a one state reality. And the way that I try and put it simplistically is, there's a choice. Israel can either, give Palestinians a state, or they can give them equal rights. Unfortunately, I don't think a one state solution is like would be a viable state. I think it goes again, obviously any kind of peace process will have to involve compromise from both parties, and Palestinians, will not be able to live, Palestinians will not be able to call the land between the river and the sea historic Palestine. And in that way, it doesn't, fulfill all of, Palestinian nationalism. But I am personally, and I've, been saying this for a while, and Jad and I have had conversations about this, that I'm very much for the model of binational confederation, which, allows for more freedom of movement. I think recognizes the intertwined natures of both society, but I think gives recognition that both societies at present are highly nationalistic, highly divided, and, would not be able to power share to the level that would be required in a single democratic state. I'm in theory for it 30, 40 years down the line, but I think the factionalism within both societies would lead, a one state Israel Palestine to look pretty much how Lebanon looks now. And so for that reason, I don't, support the implementation of a one state solution. Presently, I certainly don't support the implementation of a one state solution if it means that it's a state where, Jews have citizenship and rights and Palestinians have no citizenship and no rights, which is, currently the most likely direction things are headed in. But, I think that I hope that Trump does not win this election. I think, as I said, I think a second term Biden, whether it's Biden, whether, it's Kamala, would be more movable. And so I think if people do, sort of swallow their pride and make the right move in terms of eating the pork, and not starving, I think that, if as soon as we do that, we organize and we mobilize and we continue to put pressure on the Democratic administration to, support peace, because that is the only way to bring both people's security and long lasting security. And, Israelis are never going to be safe, like oppressing and occupying Palestinians and deny them their rights and freedom and self-determination. And so I think it's possible to move a democratic presidency in that direction. I don't think it's possible with Republicans. And so I think that if we want to see the best possible future for Israelis and Palestinians, we have to hold our nose, elect who's ever on the Democratic ticket, and then the second they, enter office for their second term, we don't give up and we put pressure on them to do the right thing.
Amen.
And if I can add one thing, Elijah, real quickly, and I just want to continue that point just briefly. You're absolutely correct about that. And Elijah and I, what we often mention is we also talk about the state platforms, for example, the Texas Democratic and Republican platforms. I mean, it's night and day. The Republican platform calls for the complete dissolving of an idea of a Palestinian state. Meanwhile, the Texas Democratic platform is arguably one of the most progressive state platforms we have in the country. In fact, it calls for repealing anti-BDS laws. It calls for the establishment of a Palestinian state. It calls for conditioning arms to Israel. It calls for proper negotiations. I mean, Elijah and I both were very impressed. And that is, that's what the Democratic Party can be. The Republican Party will not be that. And so it might not all be perfect, but when you have states like Texas, a pretty conservative state, all things considered, that is willing to put that on a platform, that is the potential change that we can strive for. And it only will happen if we continue to elect Democratic leaders.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the message is, what I've seen is people are going to come out if they like the grassroots candidate. And the majority of these grassroots candidates tend to have more progressive positions on Israel-Palestine. Like Jad said, conditioning aid to Israel, right of return, two states recognizing a Palestinian state immediately. That's what we're seeing at the local and state levels for our caucuses. And that's what needs to be implemented at the top. Because if we're all coming out to vote for these local candidates, that should send a message to the top that they should follow suit. And that's where the pressure is going to come from. Jad, Rachel, I appreciate you coming on. This has been a fantastic episode, and this is our first episode of Semitic Sundays. Thank you all for joining, and we will come back to you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks.